She was heading for the door at 3 in the morning. Her bags packed, her mother's cameo left on the kitchen table as a goodbye she could not say out loud. Then Silas appeared in the hallway. His eyes were red, his voice was rough, and what he said next changed everything. But to understand why those words mattered, you need to know how Winifred Ashmore ended up in a dead woman's room on a Montana ranch with $4 to her name and three mountain men who were about to become the only family she had ever known. It started with a locket gate and a man who did not have the courage to keep his promises. The stagecoach was already gone. Winifred Ashmore stood at the lock gate with her hands pressed against rough pine planks, watching the last trace of dust dissolve into the November sky like a prayer nobody answered. The driver had dumped her luggage in the dirt, pocketed his fare, and whipped his horses eastward without so much as a backward glance. She could not blame him. A man hauling freight across the Bitterroot Valley had no business getting tangled in another man's broken promises. Behind her, two leather suitcases and a cedar trunk lay scattered across Montana earth like the wreckage of a shipwreck nobody would come to salvage. Inside the trunk were her mother's china plates wrapped in yesterday's newspapers, three cotton dresses, a Bible with her father's handwriting in the margins, and a gold locket containing two tiny photographs of parents she would never see again. Inside her coin purse, she had exactly $4.11. And in front of her, wrapped twice around the gatepost with a padlock the size of a man's fist, was a chain that said everything Phineas Bradley's letters had not. You are not welcome here. The wind came down off the Bitterroot Mountains like something with teeth cutting through her navy blue traveling dress and the wool coat beneath it as though neither existed. November in Montana was not November in New Hampshire. November in New Hampshire was golden leaves and wood smoke, and her mother's apple cider warming on the stove. November in Montana was a killing thing, patient and absolute, and it had already started measuring her for a grave. Winifred closed her eyes. She would not cry. Crying was a luxury reserved for women who had somewhere to go. When the tears dried, she had nowhere. Not anymore. Not since the morning 6 months ago when Reverend Ambrose Ashmore collapsed at his pulpit in Portsmouth and never rose again, and the bankmen came 3 days later with papers that turned her childhood home into someone else's property. She opened her eyes. The gate was still locked. The land beyond it stretched toward purple mountains under a sky so enormous it made her feel like an insect on a tablecloth. No house in sight, no chimney smoke, no sign that any human being had ever found reason to stay in this godforsaken valley. A hawk circled overhead, riding invisible currents of air and with an ease that bordered on contempt. From up there, Winifred Ashmore would be nothing more than a dark speck beside a fence post. Barely worth the effort of a second look. Before we go on, friends, if you are new here, welcome. I share New Frontier stories every week, tales of mountain men and mail-order brides of hard land and harder choices, and of the kind of love that has to be earned before it can be kept. Hit that subscribe button below and drop me a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. I want to know, are you out in Texas, up in the Appalachian Hills, somewhere along the Rockies where stories like this one were born? Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. 3 months earlier, in the sweltering August heat of a Boston boarding house, Winifred had found the advertisement that would ruin her life and save it in equal measure. She had been sitting on a narrow bed in a room she shared with two other women, both seamstresses at a garment factory on Milk Street, reading a copy of the Heart and Home Matrimonial Journal that one of them had left on the windowsill. The journal cost 10 cents and contained 40 pages of advertisements from men across the Western Territories seeking wives. Most of the listings were crude, barely literate, offering little beyond acreage and the promise of hard work. But one had caught her eye like a fishhook catches flesh. Respectable landowner in Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory seeks educated God-fearing wife for partnership and companionship. I own 400 acres of good grazing land, a house with a porch where a woman might read in the evenings, and a view of mountains that will make you forget whatever you left behind. I am not a rich man, but I am an honest one. Women of learning and character preferred. Travel expenses provided. Phineas Bradley, General Delivery, Collier Creek, Montana Territory. Winifred had read it 3 times. Then she had torn it from the page and pressed it into her Bible beside the dried wildflower her mother had placed there 15 years ago. She wrote to Phineas Bradley that same evening. He wrote back within 3 weeks. His penmanship was careful. His sentences measured his descriptions of Montana vivid enough to make her believe she could see the mountains from her cramped Boston room. He asked about her education. She told him about her father's library, about the Latin and French she had learned alongside scripture, about the years she had spent teaching piano to the daughters of families far wealthier than her own. He asked about her faith. She told him it had been tested and had survived. He asked if she was afraid of hard work. She told him she was afraid of having no work at all. By September, he had sent $80 for her train fare. It was more money than Winifred had seen in one place since her father's death. She held the bank notes in her hands and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. She packed everything she owned into 2 suitcases in a cedar trunk, said goodbye to the seamstresses who barely noticed her leaving, and boarded a westbound train with her stomach full of butterflies and her head full of pictures that turned out to be painted on smoke. The journey took 4 weeks. Train from Boston to New York. Train from New York to Chicago, where she changed stations and spent a night in a hotel that smelled of coal dust and boiled cabbage. Train from Chicago to St. Louis, where she boarded a Missouri River steamboat that groaned and shuddered upstream for 6 days. Then a Wells Fargo stagecoach from Fort Benton, southwestward, into the mountains, jolting over roads that were little more than suggestions carved into wilderness. Along the way, she met a Dutch family heading to Oregon with 7 children and a milk cow tied to their wagon. She met a one-legged Confederate veteran who played harmonica at every stop and never spoke about the war. She met a school teacher bound for Wyoming who told her that the West ate women like kindling and spat out the ashes. Winifred thanked her for the encouragement and kept going. Every night, by the light of whatever candle or lamp she could borrow, she read Phineas Bradley's letters again. His words were her compass. His promises were her map. And when the stagecoach finally crested Lost Trail Pass and she saw the Bitterroot Valley for the first time spread out below her like a green and gold quilt stitched between enormous purple mountains, she pressed her mother's locket to her lips and whispered, "This will be home, Mama. I have found it." She had not found it. She had found Phineas Bradley. He was waiting at the Collier Creek Depot, a settlement of perhaps 200 souls clustered along a muddy main street. She had expected a man who matched his letters, someone solid and earnest with calloused hands and kind eyes. What she got was a thin, fidgeting creature of about 41, with a face the color of cold ash and eyes that could not hold still long enough to meet hers. He smelled faintly of whiskey. "Miss Ashmore," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable of her name. "I am Bradley." She smiled. She extended her hand. She said something bright about the beauty of the valley, something she had rehearsed during the last 50 miles of stagecoach road. He shook her hand the way a man handles a dead trout briefly and with evident distaste and turned toward his wagon without another word. The ride out was 40 miles of silence. Winifred tried conversation. She asked about his land, about the town, about the winters, about the mountains. She got grunts and half sentences, and the occasional direction to the hired driver who sat between them on the wagon bench. Bradley would not look at her. His hands gripped the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles were white. She stopped talking somewhere around mile 20 and watched Montana roll past and felt her hope curdle into something harder and colder, like milk left too long in the sun. When they reached the gate, he finally spoke more than 3 words together. "This was a mistake, Miss Ashmore." Winifred felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. "I cannot do this. I thought I could, but I cannot. You are a lady from New Hampshire, an educated woman, a reverend's daughter." He stared at the locked gate as though it were a mirror showing him something he despised. "I am a broke dirt farmer who cannot even pay his debts. I wrote those letters because I was lonely, because I wanted to believe I could be the man I described. But I am not that man, and you deserve better than what I have to offer, which is nothing." Winifred's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The numbness was spreading now, that cold, disconnected feeling she recognized from the morning her father died, as though she were watching this happen to someone else from a great distance. "You invited me here," she managed at last. "You sent money. You wrote letters for 3 months. I know what I did. So what changed?" He looked at her then, really looked, and what she saw in his face was not cruelty. Cruelty would have been simpler, something she could have hated cleanly and moved past. What she saw was nothing. Emptiness. The face of a man who had already decided she did not matter and was simply waiting for her to accept it. "Nothing changed," he said. "That is the problem. Go to town, Miss Ashmore. There is a boarding house. You can stay there until you figure out whatever you need to figure out." He climbed onto a horse tied to the wagon. She had not even noticed it there. He said something to the driver about extra fare. Then he rode through the gate without unlocking it for her, without looking back, and disappeared over the first hill like a man fleeing the scene of his own cowardice. The driver muttered about not getting involved in domestic affairs, dumped her luggage in the dirt, and followed the road eastward. And now Winifred Ashmore sat on her mother's cedar trunk in the fading Montana light, 24 years old, orphaned, jilted $4 from destitution, and tried to think of a single reason not to lie down in the dirt and let the November cold take her. She could not think of one. But she did not lie down either. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as Sunday bells. "Winifred, do not you dare feel guilty for living." And though her mother had been speaking about guilt and not survival, Winifred heard something else in it tonight. A command. Keep going, even when there is no road, especially then. She heard the horses before she saw them. Not one horse. 3. Coming from the north, moving at an easy walk that suggested men who knew exactly where they were and felt no urgency about it. The sound grew from a distant rhythm into something close and raw, and Winifred stood up from her trunk and turned toward it with her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 riders crested the hill against the last band of orange sky, and for a moment they were nothing but silhouettes. Enormous silhouettes. Men built on a scale that New Hampshire did not produce, sitting their horses with the easy authority of creatures born to the saddle. Each of them carried a rifle across his lap. Each of them wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. They stopped 20 paces from where she stood, and the lead rider raised one gloved hand in a signal that halted the others behind him. The silence stretched. Then the lead rider spoke, and his voice was like gravel rolling down a creek bed, low and rough and unhurried. "Evening, ma'am. My name is Silas Whitaker. These are my brothers, Ezra and Ransom. You appear to be in some difficulty." Winifred looked up at him. He was the biggest of the 3, which was saying something because all 3 of them were the biggest men she had ever seen. Silas Whitaker sat atop a black horse the size of a small cathedral, and even from 20 paces she could see the scar that cut through his left eyebrow and vanished into his hairline. His face looked like it had been carved from hardwood by someone who valued function over beauty, then left outdoors for several decades. His eyes were amber, the color of whiskey, held up to firelight, and they were studying her with the careful attention of a man who missed nothing and revealed less. Behind him and to his left, the second rider had lighter features, a clean-shaven jaw, and eyes that held something warmer than his brother's granite stillness. He carried a Spencer repeating rifle with the ease of long familiarity, and there was a scar along his right forearm that looked like it had been made by a bayonet. This was Ezra, the middle brother, and though Winifred did not know it yet, he had seen things at Atlanta and Savannah that had taught him the exact weight of human suffering. The third rider sat slightly apart, mounted on a gray speckled horse that seemed as wild-tempered as its master. He had the fullest beard of the 3, dark chestnut, streaked with copper from the sun, and his hair fell past his collar in untamed waves. He wore a fringed buckskin jacket and carried a Winchester rifle slung across his back alongside a hunting knife that could have dressed an elk. This was Ransom, the youngest, and his eyes were already reading the ground around Winifred's feet, tracking the hoof prints in wagon ruts the way another man might read a newspaper. Ransom spoke first, though not to her. "Silas, Bradley went through the gate heading northwest. Tracks are maybe 2 hours old. He bolted." Silas Whitaker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned those amber eyes back to Winifred. You are Bradley's woman, he said. Not a question. I was supposed to be, she answered, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. He changed his mind. Silas studied her face for a long moment. Then he studied the luggage scattered in the dirt, the locked gate, the empty road stretching in both directions toward nothing. How much money you got? The question was so direct, it nearly startled a laugh out of her. I do not see how that is your concern. How much? She swallowed. $4, maybe a little more. Will not get you far. I am aware of that, Mr. Whitaker. Thank you. Something moved behind those amber eyes. Not quite amusement. Something more like recognition. The look of a man watching someone refuse to break under a weight that should have broken them already. Ezra leaned forward in his saddle and spoke for the first time, his voice softer than his brother's, but carrying the same mountain bedrock beneath it. Miss Ashmore, Phineas Bradley owes our family $200. We rode down here tonight to collect on that debt. I expect we will not be collecting anything from a man who has fled his own property. You know my name, Winifred said. Small Valley. Word travels. We heard Bradley had sent for a bride from back east. Figured we would settle accounts before the wedding complicated matters. Then you know what happened. We can guess, Ezra said gently, and I am sorry for it. Ransom had dismounted without a sound and was examining the padlock on the gate. He spat once into the dust, a gesture of pure contempt directed at the absent Bradley, then turned to Winifred with the first words he had spoken to her directly. Can you shoot? She blinked. Excuse me. A rifle? Pistol. Can you handle a firearm? I have never touched one in my life. He nodded once as though this confirmed something he already knew. I can teach you, he said simply. Ought to know out here. Silas Whitaker swung down from his black horse with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a man his size. Standing, he was taller than she had imagined, 6.5 feet of weathered muscle and quiet authority. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, and in that single gesture, Winifred saw something she had not expected. Manners, the old-fashioned, bone-deep kind that could not be faked because they were not learned but inherited. Miss Ashmore, he said, our ranch is about 5 miles north of here. Whitaker Ranch. My brothers and I have lived there since our father, Thaddeus Whitaker, built it in 1854. Our mother, Rebecca, passed in 56. Our father passed in 68. So did my wife, Margaret. That was 8 years ago. He paused, and in the pause, Winifred heard the wound that time had scabbed over, but never healed. We are not married men, he continued. None of us at present. But we are not alone either. A woman named Hattie O'Donnell has kept our household since my mother died. She is 64 years old. She is tougher than all three of us combined, and she would sooner set the house on fire than allow any impropriety under her roof. He met Winifred's eyes. We need help. Hattie is getting older. The house needs a woman's hand. Cooking, cleaning, keeping the books, because the books are a disaster and none of us have the patience for figures. $15 a month plus room and board. Your own room with a lock on the door. You would be treated with respect, or Hattie would take a wooden spoon to whichever one of us forgot his manners. You have my word as a Whitaker, and a Whitaker's word is the only currency that has never lost its value in this valley. Winifred stared at him. 3 men she had never met, a ranch in the middle of nowhere, a winter bearing down like a locomotive, and $4 in her purse. Mr. Whitaker, she said carefully, I appreciate your offer more than I can express, but I am sure you understand my hesitation. I am a single woman. You are 3 unmarried men. Silas nodded. I would be cautious too, in your place. That is why I mentioned Hattie. Come to the ranch tonight if nothing else. It is too late and too cold for you to stay here, and the next stagecoach does not pass for 4 days. Meet Hattie, sleep under a solid roof, eat a hot meal, and decide in the morning whether you want to stay or whether you want us to drive you to the boarding house in Collier Creek. Ezra added quietly, a man keeps his word. Miss Ashmore, that is what our father taught us. If Silas says you are safe, you are safe. Ransom said nothing. He had already begun loading her luggage onto a pack mule he had brought along, handling her mother's cedar trunk, as though it weighed nothing, securing it with knots that spoke of years spent roping cattle and breaking horses. Winifred looked at the lock gate one more time. She looked at the empty road behind her, vanishing into darkness and distance and a past that held nothing worth returning to. She looked at the sky where the first stars of evening were appearing like small, cold promises. Then she looked at Silas Whitaker's outstretched hand. She took it. His grip was calloused and warm and solid, the hand of a man who had built things with it and intended to build more. He helped her up behind Ezra on the chestnut horse named Lincoln, because Ezra was the calmest rider, and Silas had decided without asking that this was the safest arrangement for a woman who had never ridden double in her life. Winifred gripped the back of Ezra's coat as the animal shifted beneath her. "Hold on," Silas said, mounting his own horse. "Road is rough in the dark." They rode north, away from the locked gate, away from the scattered remnants of every plan Winifred Ashmore had ever made. Ransom led the way because he could read terrain in the dark the way other men read books. Silas rode beside Winifred and Ezra close enough that she could hear him breathing a steady rhythm that anchored her in the blindness. The pack mule followed behind, carrying her worldly possessions into the unknown. The land rose and fell in long, rolling waves covered in brown grass that whispered beneath the wind. The Bitterroot Mountains stood against the western sky like the spine of something ancient and indifferent, their peaks already white with early snow. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. The way a blizzard is beautiful. The way a river in flood is beautiful. The way a country that does not care whether you live or die can still take your breath away. Somewhere behind her, that old life was over. The girl who had answered an advertisement in a matrimonial journal, who had packed her mother's china in newspaper and traveled 2,000 miles on hope alone, that girl was already becoming someone else. Someone who did not yet have a name or a shape, but who was being forged right now in the space between one heartbeat and the next by the simple act of choosing to ride north instead of lying down. "Winter always ends," Ezra said quietly over his shoulder as though reading her thoughts. "Even the hard ones. That is what our mother used to say." Winifred said nothing, but she held on tighter and she kept her eyes on the dark horizon, and she let the rhythm of the horse carry her toward whatever was coming next. The Whitaker Ranch appeared as a cluster of warm lights in the darkness, and Winifred felt her breath catch in her chest. It was not the rough cabin she had imagined. The main house was 2 stories of solid pine with a stone chimney rising from the center like a fist and a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. Lamplight glowed behind real glass windows, which was a luxury on the frontier that spoke of a family that had been here long enough to build something worth keeping. Behind the house stood a red barn large enough to hold 40 horses, a blacksmith shed trailing wisps of smoke into the night air, a tool house, a chicken coop alive with soft clucking, and a white picket fence enclosing a kitchen garden, going dormant for winter. Along the path to the front door, she could see the skeletal remains of rose bushes, wild roses planted by a woman's hand and left to grow untended for 8 seasons. Margaret's roses, the dead wife's roses. Still reaching for the light even after the woman who planted them was gone. Silas dismounted and reached up to help Winifred down. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled on the frozen ground. He caught her elbow, steadied her, and released her the moment she had her balance. Brief, impersonal, respectful. The front door opened before they reached the porch, and a woman stepped out into the lamplight with a wooden spoon in one hand and an expression that could have curdled milk at 40 paces. Hattie O'Donnell was 64 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and built like a powder keg wrapped in a flour-dusted apron. Her hair was white and pinned so tightly against her skull that it seemed to be pulling her eyebrows upward in permanent disapproval. Her hands were red from a lifetime of scrubbing, kneading, and occasionally boxing the ears of men who forgot their manners. She had buried a husband in the mines of Virginia City in 1859, had no children of her own, and had poured every drop of maternal instinct she possessed into raising 3 motherless boys who now towered over her like pine trees over a stump. She looked at Winifred. She looked at the luggage. She looked at Silas. Silas Whitaker, she said, and her voice carried the clipped authority of a woman who had been giving orders since before the war. What in the name of St. Patrick and all his sheep have you boys dragged home this time? Hattie, this is Miss Winifred Ashmore. Phineas Bradley left her at his gate with nothing. She needs a roof tonight and a job tomorrow if she is willing. Hattie's expression changed. The disapproval did not vanish, but it redirected itself, swiveling away from the Whitaker brothers and toward the absent Phineas Bradley with a ferocity that was almost physical. That spineless letter-writing, whiskey-soaked excuse for a man, she said through clenched teeth. I told you, boys, I told you when he started writing away for a bride that he did not have the backbone God gave a jellyfish. And now look, left a child in the cold. A lady from the look of her, left her standing in the dirt like a sack of grain he did not want to carry. She turned to Winifred, and the ferocity melted into something soft and fierce at the same time, the way a mother bear is soft with her cubs and fierce with everything else. Oh, sweet girl, come here. Come inside right now. You are frozen through. I have got stew on the stove and bread in the oven and water heating for a bath. Come in, come in. Hattie pulled Winifred through the door as though rescuing her from a flood, and Winifred felt something rise in her chest that she had been holding down all day, all week, all year. It was not tears exactly. It was the feeling of being caught when you have been falling for so long you forgot you were still in the air. The inside of the Whitaker house was warm and smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, beeswax, and venison stew. The main room served as kitchen dining area and parlor in one large space dominated by a stone fireplace wide enough to roast a side of beef. A long table of rough-hewn pine sat beneath the window with 5 mismatched chairs around it. Shelves lined the walls holding jars of preserved fruit, bags of flour, and cornmeal tins of coffee and salt, and a surprising number of books. The kitchen area had a cast-iron stove that radiated heat like a small sun, and hanging from hooks above it were copper pots, iron skillets, and dried bundles of sage and thyme. It was not elegant, but it was alive. Every surface showed the evidence of people who used this space daily, who cooked and ate, and mended and read and argued. Argued and lived here with purpose and without apology. After months in borrowed rooms and rented beds, the sheer domesticity of it hit Winifred like a wave. Your room is upstairs, second door on the left, Silas said from behind her. He had carried her trunk in and set it by the wall. It was Margaret's sewing room. Nobody has used it in 8 years, but it is the best room in the house and it has been empty too long. Hattie was already pushing her toward the staircase. Go wash up, dear. Dinner in 20 minutes. You will eat first, talk later. That is the rule in this house. The room was small and clean and full of ghosts. A bed with an oak headboard and a patchwork quilt in faded blues and greens. A dresser with an oval mirror. A wooden music box in the shape of a chestnut. A sampler on the wall stitched in careful letters that read, Home is where the heart rests. White cotton curtains with pale blue flowers. And on the dresser, in a plain wooden frame, a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a shy, delicate smile standing on this very porch when the house was newer and the roses were in bloom. Margaret. Maisie. The woman Silas Whitaker had loved and lost. Winifred picked up the frame and studied the face. There was something fragile about her. Something that made Winifred think of flowers that bloomed too early and could not survive the first hard frost. I will take care of your home, Margaret, she whispered to the photograph. I promise. She opened the music box. A lullaby tinkled out, thin and sweet, the kind of melody a mother might hum to a child she never had the chance to hold. Winifred closed it gently and went downstairs to eat. The stew was extraordinary. Venison and root vegetables in a broth dark with herbs, served with Hattie's cornbread and black coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail. Winifred tried not to eat like a woman who had skipped 2 meals, but the food was so good and her body was so hungry that restraint became impossible. The 3 brothers ate with the methodical efficiency of men who viewed meals as fuel rather than ceremony. Silas drank his coffee, scalding hot and black. Ezra ate slowly, savoring, occasionally glancing at Winifred with a warmth he did not try to hide. Ransom ate like a wolf, fast and thorough, cleaning his bowl in half the time it took anyone else, and then sitting back to whittle a small piece of wood with his hunting knife, his amber eyes watching everything and everyone from beneath the brim of his hat. After the bowls were cleared, Silas sat across from Winifred and laid out the terms. $15 a month, room and board included, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and keeping the household accounts if she had the skill. Breakfast at 5, dinner at 7. Hattie would show her where everything was. She was not expected to work outdoors. That was the brothers' domain. She could come and go as she pleased, attend church in Collier Creek when the weather allowed, and save her wages for whatever future she chose to build. If at any point she wished to leave, they would provide transport to Collier Creek or to the nearest railroad station, no questions asked. A man keeps his word, Silas said, or he is not a man at all. You will be safe here, Miss Ashmore. That is my promise and the promise of my brothers. Ezra nodded. Ransom looked up from his whittling long enough to meet Winifred's eyes, and in his gaze she saw something unexpected. Not warmth exactly, something more like the wordless understanding of a man who had spent his whole life reading the wilderness and could recognize a fellow creature in danger when he saw one. Winifred set down her coffee cup. Mr. Whitaker, I accept your terms, with a gratitude I cannot properly express. Then call me Silas, he said. Mr. Whitaker was my father, and please call me Winifred. Miss Ashmore sounds like someone I no longer am. Something passed across Silas Whitaker's face, a flicker of something beneath the granite. He nodded once. Welcome to Whitaker Ranch, Winifred. Hattie handed her a candle and a clean towel and pointed her toward the stairs. Get some sleep, dear. Morning comes early in this house, and tomorrow we will see about making this arrangement work for everybody. Winifred climbed the stairs to Margaret's room and sat on the edge of the bed with the patchwork quilt soft beneath her hands. Through the window, she could see more stars than she had ever seen in her life, scattered across the Montana sky like salt spilled on dark velvet. There was no city glow to dim them, no street lamps, no noise of carriages or voices or machinery. Just silence. The deep, absolute, ancient silence of a land that had been here long before people arrived and would be here long after they were gone. She should feel grateful. She had shelter. She had food. She had the promise of work and wages and safety. But lying back on the quilt, staring at the ceiling of a dead woman's room in a house full of strangers, all Winifred Ashmore felt was lost. Lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the simple, devastating truth that she had come 2,000 miles looking for a home and found a locked gate instead. She closed her eyes. She made herself count the stars she had seen through the window one by one, like her mother had taught her to count blessings. 1 for the roof over her head, 2 for the stew in her belly, 3 for the warmth of the stove below, 4 for the woman named Hattie, who had pulled her inside as though she mattered, 5 for the man named Silas, whose word she was beginning to believe was as solid as the mountains outside her window. She reached 6 before sleep came and pulled her under. And somewhere in the darkness, in a barn that smelled of hay and horse and honest labor, Silas Whitaker sat on an overturned bucket and held his dead wife's photograph in his calloused hands and tried to understand why the sight of a frightened woman standing alone at a locked gate had cracked open something inside him that he had spent 8 years bricking shut. He set the photograph on the shelf above his workbench, facing outward, where Maisie could watch over the barn the way she used to watch over the kitchen. Winter always ends, he said to her picture, even the hard ones. Then he blew out the lantern and went to bed, and the Whitaker Ranch settled into the kind of silence that comes just before everything changes. Winifred learned the rhythm of the ranch the way a sailor learns the rhythm of the sea, not all at once, but in small daily discoveries that accumulated into something like knowledge, something like belonging, something she was still too cautious to call home. She woke before dawn every morning because her body remembered the boarding house schedule and would not let her sleep past 4. The first 3 days, she crept downstairs to find Hattie already at the stove, the old woman moving through her morning rituals with the silent precision of someone who had performed them 10,000 times. Coffee first, always coffee first. Not the weak civilized coffee of New Hampshire parlors, but Montana coffee black as midnight and thick enough to stand a spoon in brewed by dumping coarse ground beans into boiling water and letting them fight it out for 3 minutes before straining the result into tin cups that had seen more sunrises than most men. By the fourth morning, Winifred was at the stove before Hattie, and the old woman found her elbow deep in cornbread batter with bacon already sizzling in the cast iron skillet. Hattie stopped in the doorway and watched. "Your mother teach you that?" Winifred nodded without turning. "My mother taught me everything that mattered. The rest I learned on my own after she was gone." Hattie said nothing for a long moment. Then she tied on her apron and took her place beside Winifred at the stove, and they worked together in a silence that felt less like absence and more like agreement. When the brothers came down at 5, the table was set with cornbread, warm from the oven eggs, fried in bacon fat, with sprigs of dried rosemary, thick slices of smoked pork and coffee that could have fueled a locomotive. Ransom sat down, took one bite of cornbread, and stopped chewing. He looked at Hattie. Hattie pointed at Winifred with her wooden spoon. "That is her doing, not mine. The girl has a gift." Ransom took another bite, closed his eyes briefly, and said the longest sentence Winifred had yet heard from him. "This is the best cornbread I have eaten in 32 years of living. Do not tell Hattie I said that." I heard every word Hattie called from the kitchen, and if you think flattering the new girl will get you out of mucking the horse stalls this morning, you are gravely mistaken. It was the first time Winifred laughed on Montana soil, a real laugh, small but genuine, the kind that surprises you because you had forgotten the muscles it requires. Ezra looked up from his coffee and smiled at her, and the warmth in it was so unexpected that she looked away quickly and busied herself with the coffee pot. Silas said nothing, but he ate every crumb of cornbread on his plate and went back for a second piece, which Hattie later told Winifred in a whisper that he had never done in 8 years of her cooking. The days found their shape. Breakfast at 5. The brothers would head out before first light, Silas to check fences and cattle, and do the endless repair work that a ranch in mountain country demanded Ezra to manage the hay stores and equipment and the 100 small decisions that kept an operation of this size functional. Ransom to hunt or track or do whatever mysterious work he did alone in the wilderness that kept the ranch supplied with fresh game and kept his own restless spirit from eating itself alive. Winifred would clean, cook, manage the kitchen garden's winter stores, and gradually take over the household tasks that Hattie's aging hands could no longer manage without pain. Hattie taught her frontier cooking the way a master carpenter teaches an apprentice, through doing rather than explaining. How to stretch a single haunch of venison into 4 days of meals. How to make biscuits that rose properly in the thin mountain air, where the altitude played tricks on every recipe she knew from sea level. How to preserve eggs in lime water for the weeks when the hens stopped laying in the deep cold. How to render bear fat into cooking lard that would keep all winter in the cold cellar beneath the kitchen floor. How to bake bread that did not turn to rocks, which Hattie said was the one skill that separated frontier women who survived from those who went mad. But the real education came from the ranch itself. Ransom was the one who showed her the property. He appeared at the kitchen door one morning in her second week with his hat pushed back and an expression on his face that suggested he had been arguing with himself about something and had lost. "Silas says you ought to know where everything is," he said, "in case of emergency." He led her through the barn first. 12 working horses stood in their stalls. Heavy, muscled animals bred for pulling and carrying and surviving winters that would have killed a purebred thoroughbred in a week. 3 riding horses occupied the best stalls: Silas's enormous black Titan, Ezra's chestnut Lincoln, and Ransom's gray speckled Ghost, who nipped at Winifred's slee with her sleeve and then nuzzled her palm when she did not flinch. Ghost does not take to most people, Ransom said, watching this exchange with raised eyebrows. She likes you. That means something. 40 bales of hay were stacked to the rafters for winter feed. Saddles and bridles hung from iron hooks along the wall, each one maintained with the obsessive care that frontier men gave to equipment their lives depended on. Farrier tools for shoeing horses hung in the corner because Silas did the farrier work himself, one of a dozen skills he had absorbed out of necessity and performed with quiet expertise. The cattle operation was larger than Winifred had expected. 200 Hereford cows with their distinctive white faces and red bodies, 8 bulls, and somewhere around 50 calves that would need to be branded come spring. 3 milk cows occupied a separate enclosure near the house, producing enough cream and butter to supply the household and trade with neighbors for goods the ranch could not produce on its own. The blacksmith shed was Silas's domain, and stepping into it was like stepping into the man's mind. A coal-fired forge with a 150-pound anvil dominated the center. Hammers of 6 different sizes hung on the wall in order of weight. Tongs files, quenching troughs, and half-finished projects lined the workbenches. Silas forged his own horseshoes, repaired wagon, hardware mended broken tools, and occasionally crafted hinges and latches for the buildings. He was constantly improving. The shed smelled of hot iron coal smoke and the particular mineral tang of quenched metal, and when Winifred stood in the doorway and watched Silas work the anvil one afternoon, the hammer rising and falling with a rhythm as precise as a metronome, she understood something about him that his silence had never revealed. He was a builder, a maker, a man who expressed himself not in words, but in the things he shaped with his hands. The winter stores were impressive enough to make Winifred revise every assumption she had made about the poverty of frontier life. 500 pounds of jerk venison hung in the smokehouse. 200 pounds of smoked beef occupied a separate rack. Sacks of dried beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee sugar, and salt stood stacked floor to ceiling in the stone-walled cellar beneath the kitchen. Jars of preserved strawberries, pears, and crab apples that Hattie had put up in September lined the shelves like jewels in a crown. Potatoes buried in sand bins, sauerkraut and pickled cucumbers in stone crocks. Enough food to sustain 5 adults through 6 months of winter, with a margin for visitors' emergencies and the frankly astonishing appetites of 3 men who burned 5,000 calories a day doing work that would have killed most city dwellers before noon. This place could survive a siege, Winifred said quietly, standing in the cellar and looking at the organized rows of provisions. Ransom, leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, said simply, "It has." The discovery that changed the shape of her role on the ranch came on her 10th day, and it did not happen in the barn or the kitchen or the winter stores. It happened in the small room off the parlor that served as the ranch office, where Ezra had been struggling with the account books for the better part of an afternoon and losing the fight. He was sitting at a desk buried under a landslide of receipts, invoices, handwritten notes, and scraps of paper covered in numbers that contradicted each other with cheerful abandon. His auburn hair was standing at odd angles where he had been raking his fingers through it, and his expression was that of a man who would rather wrestle a bull than reconcile a ledger. Winifred paused in the doorway with a cup of coffee and watched him for a moment. "May I look?" she asked. Ezra glanced up, his expression hovering between embarrassment and hope. "You know, figures my father kept the church accounts. After he died, I managed the household finances for 2 years on income that would have made a church mouse weep. And I kept books for the family I worked for in Boston before that position ended." She set the coffee down and pulled a chair beside him. "Show me what you have." What he had was chaos. 6 months of financial records kept by 3 men who would rather shoe a horse in a thunderstorm than sit down with a pencil and paper. Expenses mixed with income. Barter trades listed alongside cash transactions with no indication of which was which. A cattle sale from April recorded twice at different amounts because nobody remembered which figure was correct. Charitable donations to the Collier Creek Church listed as operating costs. Winifred sorted through the mess with the focused calm of a woman who had found at last a problem she knew how to solve. Within 3 hours, she had separated the receipts into categories, identified the discrepancies, corrected the April cattle sale error, and begun constructing a simple ledger system that any of the brothers could maintain. Here, she said, pointing to a column, in April, you sold 12 calves, but only recorded 10. The other two went to Reverend Thompson at the church as a donation for the orphan fund. They need to be listed separately as charitable giving, not as a sale. And here the payment from your neighbor Anderson was in gold dust, not paper currency. At current exchange rates, the actual value is $47, not 42. You have been undercounting your income by about 8% all year. Ezra stared at the pages as though they had rearranged themselves into a foreign language, and Winifred had just provided the translation. You did this in 3 hours, he said. It is not complicated once you organize it. It has been a disaster for 5 years. I would call that complicated. He went to find Silas. That evening after dinner, Silas sat at the table and examined the summary sheets Winifred had prepared. His expression did not change, but Winifred had begun to learn that Silas Whitaker's face was like the surface of a deep lake. The stillness on top did not mean nothing was happening underneath. Can you manage the books going forward, he asked. I would be glad to. Then I am raising your wages, $20 a month instead of 15. Winifred hesitated. Silas, you cannot afford that right now. I have seen the numbers. If your numbers are right, I can, especially if you keep the books like this. He gestured at the organized pages. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something in them that was not grief or granite. It was respect, the kind that is not given freely but earned, and once earned is never taken back. Deal, deal. They shook hands across the table. His calloused palm was warm against hers, and something passed between them in that contact, brief as a spark, but just as real. Silas released her hand a fraction of a second too quickly and turned away toward the coffee pot with an expression she could not read. Hattie, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, smiled into her apron and said nothing at all. The weeks turned, and with them, the household began to change in ways that were small individually, but seismic in accumulation. Winifred learned how each brother took his coffee. Silas wanted it black and hot enough to blister skin. Ezra added a splash of cream when it was available and drank it slowly as though each cup were a small ceremony. Ransom did not care about temperature or cream, but wanted it strong enough to stun a mule, and he drank it from the same dented tin cup every morning without fail. She learned their rhythms. Silas was the first one up and the last one to bed, carrying the ranch on his shoulders with a quiet, relentless endurance that reminded her of oxen she had seen pulling plows in New Hampshire, animals that did not stop because stopping was not in their nature. Ezra was the thinker, the planner, the one who saw problems before they arrived and devised solutions that the other two executed. Ransom was the eyes and ears and instinct of the operation, the one who could smell a storm 2 days out, track a stray calf across 5 miles of frozen ground, and know by the behavior of the birds whether predators were near. She learned other things too. That Silas had a bad left shoulder from a mining accident in '68, the same year he lost Margaret and his father, and that he rolled it unconsciously when storms were coming, grimacing when he thought no one was watching. That Ezra read books in the evening by the fire, working through a library his father had accumulated over decades, volumes of Thoreau and Emerson and Whitman, alongside practical texts on animal husbandry and law. That Ransom whittled small wooden animals with his hunting knife, his thick fingers impossibly delicate on the soft pine, producing creatures so lifelike that Winifred found herself reaching for one once before remembering it was not real. And she learned slowly and with the particular ache of delayed understanding that the Whitaker brothers were lonely. Not in the way that city people are lonely, surrounded by thousands and connected to none. In the harder way, the way of men who had built their world to need no one and had succeeded so completely that they had sealed themselves inside it like monks in a monastery, with the silence and the work and the mountains standing in for everything they had decided they could live without. On her 14th night at the ranch, Winifred could not sleep. She went downstairs for water and found Silas sitting alone by the dying fire in the main room, holding a small photograph in his calloused hands. She should have gone back upstairs. She knew that. A proper woman would have retreated to the safety of Margaret's room with its patchwork quilt and its music box and its portrait of a woman who would never grow old. Instead, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. He did not look up when she sat. His thumb moved across the edge of the photograph frame the way a man touches something precious and fragile. She was from Chicago, he said at last, and his voice was rougher than usual, as though the words had to fight their way past something in his throat. I met her in 1867 at a cattlemen's dinner in Illinois. She was there with her father. She played piano. She laughed at my jokes, which was generous because I do not have any. We married that spring. He paused. The fire popped. Outside, the November wind pressed against the shuttered windows like an animal trying to get in. I brought her here because this was my life and I wanted her in it. I did not ask whether this life was something she could survive. She was gentle, refined, everything this land is not. She tried. Lord knows she tried. She planted those roses by the front path with her own hands, brought the cuttings all the way from Chicago wrapped in wet cloth. She learned to cook from Hattie. She tried to learn to ride. But this country takes your measure quick, and if you come up short, it does not offer a second chance. The fever came in September of '68. Same month my father passed. 3 days. She was gone in 3 days. I rode 60 miles for a doctor who arrived 12 hours too late. I buried them both in the same week, Margaret and Pa. And after that, I decided I would never bring another person into this valley who was not strong enough to walk out of it on their own if they had to. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 8 years of grief compressed into a space too small to hold it. Winifred was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady because steadiness was what he needed and what she could give. My mother died when I was 20. Consumption. 18 months of watching her disappear one cough at a time. I held her hand for the last 7 days. She could not eat. She could barely breathe. But on the last night, she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "Winifred, do not you dare feel guilty for living." It took me 4 years to understand what she meant. She looked at Silas across the firelight. Some deaths do not belong to us, Silas. They belong only to Bonan and the person who is dying. We do not get to carry them, no matter how much we want to. And blaming ourselves for being the ones who survived does not honor the dead. It just punishes the living. He turned his face toward the fire, and in the wavering light, she saw moisture on his cheeks that he made no effort to hide or to wipe away. "You are the first person in 8 years," he said, "who has not told me it was not my fault." Everyone says that. The preacher. Hattie. My brothers. "It was not your fault, Silas. You could not have known. As if knowing would have changed anything. As if fault is the thing that matters when the woman you love is dead and the house is empty." Winifred shook her head gently. "I will not tell you that because fault is not the right word for what you carry. Grief is the right word. And grief does not care about fault or blame or reason. It just stays until you are ready to let it change shape. Not disappear. Just change into something you can carry without it breaking your back." He looked at her for a long time. The firelight played across the scar on his eyebrow and the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they should have been for a man of 38. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a decision he had been walking toward without knowing it. Then he reached for the coffee pot and refilled both their cups, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. A warmth in the room that the fire alone could not account for. A shift in the air between two people who had begun the evening as employer and employee and were ending it as something that did not have a name yet, but that both of them could feel settling around them like the first snow of winter, quiet and inevitable and impossible to ignore. "Good night, Silas," she said at the doorway. "Good night, Winifred." She climbed the stairs and lay beneath the patchwork quilt and listened to the house settle around her. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, She did not bolt the bedroom door. The conversations multiplied in the days that followed, spreading outward from that first firelit night to include the other brothers in ways that felt natural and unforced. Ezra told her about the war on a quiet evening while they played chess on a board he had carved himself from 2 colors of Montana hardwood. He did not talk about battles at first. He talked about the smaller things, the sound of 10,000 men sleeping in an open field, the taste of hardtack softened in creek water. A boy from Indiana named Hollis, who played the fiddle every night in camp until the night at Savannah when the music stopped and nobody ever saw Hollis again. He had enlisted in the Illinois 83rd Infantry in 1864 at the age of 23. He served under Sherman during the Atlanta campaign and the March to the Sea, 11 months of walking through the heart of the Confederacy and watching the country burn behind him. He came home in '65 with a bayonet scar on his right forearm and a look in his eyes that his brothers could see, but that he would not let anyone else close enough to notice. I enrolled at Harvard Law after the war, he told Winifred, moving his bishop across the chessboard with careful deliberation. Pa had saved for years to send one of us east for an education. I was the reader, so it fell to me. 1 year in Cambridge, 1 year of Blackstone and constitutional theory and dormitory arguments about the nature of justice. And then Pa died, and Margaret died the same month, and Silas needed me, and I came home. He set the bishop down. I have not been back since. Sometimes I wonder who I would have been if I had stayed. A lawyer in Chicago, perhaps. In office with my name on the door. A different kind of life entirely. Do you regret it? Winifred asked. Ezra looked at her with those warm amber eyes that were so different from Silas's stony reserve, not softer exactly, but more willing to be seen. Ask me that again in 6 months, he said. Ransom's education came without words, as everything with Ransom did. He appeared at the kitchen door one Tuesday afternoon with a Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolver and a look on his face that said he was here on orders but did not object to the assignment. Silas wants you to learn to shoot, he said. This was Margaret's pistol. He asked me to teach you with it. He led her behind the barn where he had set up 6 tin cans on the fence rail, their labels peeling and their surfaces dented from what appeared to be years of similar target practice. He placed the revolver in her hands and showed her how to hold it standing behind her to adjust her stance, with touches that were always firm, always brief, and always exactly as proper as the distance between an unmarried man and a woman under his brother's roof demanded. Stand straight, he said, feet apart, both hands on the grip, thumb over thumb, sight along the barrel, breathe in, breathe out halfway, then squeeze, do not pull. Let the gun do what it was made to do. His voice was close to her ear, low and unhurried, and she could feel the warmth of his chest behind her shoulder like a wall of banked heat. Her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted, and she knew it, and she did not let it distract her, because Winifred Ashmore had spent her whole life channeling uncomfortable emotions into useful action. She aimed at the first can. She breathed. She squeezed. The can leaped off the fence and spun into the snow. Ransom was quiet for 3 full seconds. You have a hunter's eye, he said. Natural aim like that cannot be taught. He stepped back. The professional distance returned, but something had crossed it invisible and significant, and both of them knew it, even if neither would say so. You keep practicing, he said, already walking toward the barn. I will be with the horses if you need me. He walked faster than usual, and Winifred noticed. The first snow came 3 weeks after Winifred's arrival, and it came without warning or mercy. Silas had been rolling his bad shoulder for 2 days and watching the sky with the particular intensity of a man reading a letter addressed to him personally. Storm is building, he said over breakfast. Big one. 2 days, maybe 3. We need all the cattle pushed to the South Valley by nightfall. He and Ezra rode out before dawn into a morning that was gray and heavy and tasted of iron. Ransom stayed behind because a Mustang he had been breaking had kicked him in the calf 3 days prior, leaving a bruise the color and size of a saddle horn. He could walk, but riding was agony, and Silas had given him the kind of quiet look that even Ransom did not argue with. The snow began at noon. By 3 in the afternoon, the world had turned white and blind. By 5, the wind was screaming across the valley at 50 miles an hour, and the temperature had plunged to 15 degrees below zero. Silas and Ezra did not come home. By 7 o'clock, Ransom was reaching for his coat with the desperate energy of a man who could not sit still, while the two people he loved most in the world were somewhere in the white void outside. "I am going out there," he said. Winifred blocked the door. She was a foot shorter than him and weighed perhaps 110 pounds, and she blocked the door anyway. "Your leg will not survive the ride, and you know it. If you go down in a drift, they will be searching for 3 people instead of 2, and Hattie and I will be burying the lot of you in the spring." Ransom looked at her with something between fury and anguish, and in his eyes she saw the truth of who he really was. Not the wild one, not the tracker, the loyal one. The brother who would walk into fire for the other 2 and consider it a privilege. "If they made it to the south cabin, they are safe," she said more gently now. "And if they did not, riding blind will not save them." The anger went out of him like air from a punctured bellows. He sat down and put his head in his hands. She put her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen and made fresh coffee and brought him a puer, and they sat together in the silence that was becoming a language between all of them. The storm raged through the night. At dawn, it paused long enough for Winifred to make her decision. She woke Ransom, who had fallen into a restless sleep by the fire. "I need you to tell me how to get to the south cabin," she said. He stared at her. "It is 5 miles across open ground and drifting snow. You have never ridden alone in your life. Then you are coming with me. Your leg can handle it if we go slow. And I know first aid, Ransom. If they are hurt out there, you need me." He looked at her for a long time with those amber eyes that missed nothing, and whatever he saw in her face ended the argument. They rode together on Ghost, the only horse calm enough to carry double in post-blizzard conditions, following a guide rope that Thaddeus Whitaker had strung between the homestead and the south cabin 20 years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. The ride was brutal. Wind cut through every layer of clothing. Snow had drifted to the height of a horse's belly in places. Winifred held on to Ransom's back and concentrated on breathing and not dying, and Ransom concentrated on keeping Ghost moving forward through terrain that would have killed a less experienced horse and rider. They found the cabin after 2 hours. Smoke was coming from the chimney. Ransom kicked the door open, and there they were, stoking a fire that looked like it had been burning all night, and Ezra on the narrow cot with his right wrist cradled against his chest and his face gray with pain. "He went through the ice at the creek crossing," Silas said, his own face haggard with cold and sleeplessness. "Fell wrong, wrist is broken." "Let me see," Winifred said, and there was no uncertainty in her voice, no hesitation. She knelt beside Ezra and took his arm with hands that were steady despite the cold. The wrist was broken cleanly above the joint. She could feel the displacement through the swollen skin. She tore a strip from her cotton petticoat, used it to bind the wrist between 2 straight pieces of firewood kindling, and splinted the whole assembly with the firm, precise movements of someone who had done this before. "Where in God's name did a New Hampshire girl learn to set a bone?" Ezra asked through gritted teeth. "My father was a minister. After the war, soldiers came to our parsonage in Portsmouth, men the army surgeons had given up on. Broken bones, infected wounds, things that needed time and care, and somebody who was not afraid of blood. I helped my father from the time I was 12. She finished tying the splint and looked at him. "You are going to be fine, but you will not be using this hand for 6 weeks." Silas was standing by the door watching. His face was exhausted and frozen, and something else, something new. He looked at Winifred the way a man looks at a sunrise he did not expect to live to see. Nobody spoke about it on the ride home. Nobody needed to. But when they reached the ranch and Hattie came running out with blankets and coffee and tears she would deny having shed, Silas helped Winifred down from the horse, and his hand stayed on her waist for 1 second longer than necessary, and in that 1 second something was said without words that would take months more to say out loud. That night, after Ezra was settled and dosed with whiskey for the pain, after Hattie had fed them all and retreated to her room with her rosary, Winifred found herself alone in the kitchen with Silas for the second time. He looked at her across the table. "You rode into a blizzard for my brothers," he said. "I rode into a blizzard for my family," she answered without thinking. The word hung in the air between them like a bell that had been struck and could not be unrung. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that, but the silence was not empty. It was full of a warmth that the fire alone could not account for, in a future that neither of them had planned for, but that both of them could feel approaching steady as the spring. December deepened around the ranch like a hand closing. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, the cold more absolute. Snow lay on the ground in permanent drifts that turned the landscape into a white rolling ocean, with the Bitterroot Mountains rising from it like frozen waves. The cattle huddled in the sheltered valleys where the brothers had driven them before the storm, and twice a week Silas and Ransom rode out to check on them, bringing back reports of numbers and conditions that Winifred recorded in her meticulous ledgers. The household settled into a rhythm that felt less like arrangement and more like family. Mornings at the stove with Hattie, breakfast with the brothers, long days of work that kept everyone busy and useful. Evenings by the fire that grew longer as the trust between them deepened. One Sunday evening, with the family gathered in the main room after dinner, Silas reading the Collier Creek Sentinel, Ezra mending a bridle one-handed because his wrist was still healing, Ransom whittling a small wooden horse with impossible delicacy, and Winifred darning a tear in Ransom's shirt that he had caught on a fence nail. Hattie spoke from her rocking chair with the casual authority of a woman dropping a boulder into a pond. "Well, I do declare, if my sister Ruth could see this house now, she would say, 'I have finally got the daughter I never had.'" Nobody spoke. But all three brothers looked at Winifred at the same moment, and in the firelight, she saw something in their faces that made her breath catch, and her needle stop mid-stitch. She was not the housekeeper anymore. She was not sure what she was, but she was not that. But what she found in the next week would change everything, because trouble was coming to the Bitterroot Valley, and it was not coming on horseback. The first sign was a black lacquered carriage pulled by 4 matched bay horses that appeared on the main road to Collier Creek in mid-December, followed by 6 mounted men in dark coats carrying rifles. The second sign was the talk that began spreading through town like smoke from a slow fire, talk about land deals and water rights, and an Eastern investor with deep pockets and a silver walking stick who was buying up the valley one parcel at a time. The third sign was the morning Phineas Bradley rode up to Whitaker Ranch, looking like a man being chased by his own shadow. Winifred was kneading bread dough when she heard the horse. Not any of the Whitaker horses. She knew those sounds by now the way she knew her own heartbeat. This was a single rider moving fast coming from the south. She went to the window and felt her stomach drop. Phineas Bradley dismounted and stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and his face the color of ash, and Winifred felt a cold anger rise in her chest that she had not known she was capable of. She opened the door before he could knock. "Miss Ashmore," he said. His voice was raw. "I need to talk to you." "No, please, 5 minutes." "It is not about us. It is about this ranch, about a man named Dalton and what he is planning to do to the water supply in this valley." The name stopped her. She had heard it in town. Cornelius Dalton, the Eastern investor, the man with the silver walking stick in the flat, colorless eyes of someone who viewed land as a commodity and people as obstacles. She stepped back and let Bradley in, not because she wanted to, because she needed to know what he knew. He told her everything. Dalton had approached him 3 weeks earlier, offering to buy his entire property, including the water rights to Widow's Creek, the primary water source for Whitaker Ranch, and 3 other small operations downstream. The price was more than Bradley's whole ranch was worth. He could pay off every debt he owed and walk away free. "Did you sell?" Winifred asked. "Not yet, but I am going to." He would not meet her eyes. "I am broke, Miss Ashmore. The ranch is failing. This is my way out. Your way out ruins other people," she said, and the words came out sharp as a skinning knife. "You understand that. If Dalton controls the headwaters, Silas and his brothers lose their water supply. So do the Jacobsons. So do the Kovacs family. Everyone downstream dries up while Dalton sits upstream, controlling the valley like a man with his hand on a spigot. Bradley flinched. Those are small ranches that are struggling anyway. Dalton says consolidation is the future. Dalton says whatever helps, Dalton. Winifred replied, and you came here why? So I could talk you out of it? So you could feel better about selling your neighbors down the river because at least you warned them first. Maybe. He turned toward the door. For what it is worth, I am sorry. About November. About leaving you at the gate. I panicked. I had been writing to you for months, building up this picture in my head, and then you actually showed up and you were real, and I just could not be what you needed. I did not need much, just honesty, basic decency. Winifred held the door open, but you could not manage even that. He rode away without looking back. Winifred stood in the doorway watching him disappear and felt her hands shaking with an anger she could not quite direct. At Bradley for his weakness, at Dalton for his greed, at herself for caring. When Silas came home that evening, she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face going harder with each sentence. When she finished, he sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. Widows Creek supplies half our water, he said. If Dalton controls the headwaters, he can cut us off whenever he wants or charge so much we cannot afford to stay. Can you drill a well? Not deep enough. Water table is too low in this section of the valley. He stared at the table. I would have to move all the cattle to the east pasture year-round, and that land is too poor to sustain them. What about buying your own water rights upstream? With what money, Winifred? It took everything we had to buy this land from Pa's estate. There is nothing left. Then we find another way. The word was deliberate, we. Silas looked at her for a long time. Yeah, he said quietly, we. But the other way did not come easily, and before it came at all, Dalton made his move. He arrived at Whitaker Ranch on a Tuesday morning in a black carriage with 6 armed riders, and the temperature on the front porch dropped 20 degrees when he stepped out. Cornelius Dalton was 52 years old and dressed in a 3-piece charcoal suit that had been tailored in New York and had no business being within 1,000 miles of cattle country. He carried a silver-headed walking stick, and his eyes were the color of dishwater. He offered $3,000 for Whitaker Ranch, above market value. A generous deal, he said, for a property whose water supply he would soon control anyway. Silas stood on the porch with his brothers flanking him like pillars and told Dalton the ranch was not for sale, now or ever. Dalton smiled. Then he mentioned Winifred. I understand you have taken in a young woman, he said. Miss Winifred Ashmore, the abandoned bride of Phineas Bradley. How charitable. A woman of her quality living among 3 unmarried men. The arrangement must be, shall we say, complicated. I could offer her employment in St. Louis, proper work, respectable lodgings, if she wishes to escape her current situation. He was not offering a job. He was making a threat, and everyone on that porch knew it. Ransom moved 1 step forward, and 2 of Dalton's riders shifted their rifles. You get off our land, Ransom said, and his voice was something Winifred had never heard before, flat and cold and promising consequences. Right now, 3 days, Dalton said pleasantly. I will return for your answer. Think about what happens to Miss Ashmore's reputation if this becomes a topic of public discussion. He left. The dust settled, and Winifred came out onto the porch and said the thing that burned in her throat. He is using me against you. I should leave, no? Silas said. No, Ezra said. Over my dead body, Ransom said. But your ranch, your reputation, everything. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes was something that was not negotiable, not open to debate, not subject to the calculations of money or reputation or fear. Winifred, a man who would let a woman be driven from his home to protect his property, is not a man at all. You are family now. We fight together or we fall together. That is the Whitaker way. She felt tears on her cheeks and did not wipe them away because they were not tears of sadness. They were the tears of a woman who had spent 24 years alone and had just discovered in the space of one sentence that the loneliness was over. 2 weeks later, Dalton made his second move, and it was not a conversation, it was a dam. Bradley had sold everything, the land, the water rights, and whatever was left of his dignity. Dalton's crews began building immediately. 20 men from the Wyoming railroad camps, hauling stone and timber to the headwaters of Widow's Creek, constructing a dam that would strangle the water supply for every small ranch in the valley. And 3 nights after the dam construction began, the barn belonging to the Kovacs family, a small Hungarian immigrant family whose ranch bordered Whitaker land to the south, burned to the ground. Nobody saw who set the fire. Nobody had proof. But the Kovacs family had been among the first to refuse Dalton's land offers, and the message was clear. Winifred rode over with the brothers the next morning. She found Istvan Kovac standing in the ashes with his wife Ilona and their 3 children clustered around them. The youngest, a girl of 5 named Zofia, stood clutching a half-burned rag doll and crying in a language that Winifred did not understand but recognized perfectly. It was the sound of a child whose safe world had been set on fire. Something broke in Winifred then. Not the kind of breaking that weakens. The other kind. The kind that breaks open a door. "We are going to stop him," she said to Silas on the ride home. "Whatever it takes." But it was Winifred herself who found the weapon that would ultimately bring Dalton down, and she found it not in a rifle or a stick of dynamite, but in a letter. That evening, while the brothers argued strategy around the kitchen table, Winifred sat at the desk in the ranch office and wrote to Mr. Charles Sinclair of the First National Bank of Portsmouth, her father's oldest and most trusted friend. She asked him to investigate the Eastern Railroad Investment Company that Dalton claimed to represent. She asked him to trace Dalton's financial records through his banking connections in New York. And she asked him to share whatever he found with the Federal Marshal Service in Washington. She posted the letter the next morning and told no one. Because some fights are won with patience, not gunpowder. But some fights need both. The Christmas dance at the Collier Creek Church Hall was the social event of the season, and Winifred nearly did not go. It was Ezra who persuaded her. She needed to see the community, he said. She needed to let the community see her. Hiding on the ranch only fed the gossip, and the gossip was already running hot enough to melt snow. She wore the blue velvet dress that had been her mother's, altered by Hattie's nimble fingers to fit her smaller frame. Hattie lent her a fox fur stole that had been a gift from her late husband. When Winifred came downstairs, all 3 brothers were waiting in the parlor in their best clothes, and the looks on their faces told her everything their mouths would never say. The hall was warm and bright and full of every ranching family within 50 miles. Fiddle music filled the air. Children ran between the adults' legs, and every eye in the room turned to stare when Winifred walked in, flanked by 3 Whitaker brothers. Mrs. Henrietta Patterson, the self-appointed social arbiter of Collier Creek, materialized from the crowd with a smile that could have cut glass. "Miss Ashmore," she said, "how brave of you to come tonight. Living out at Whitaker Ranch with 3 bachelors, it must be so challenging to maintain one's reputation." Silas stepped forward, and his voice was loud enough to carry across the room. "Mrs. Patterson, with all due respect, Miss Ashmore lives under the same roof as Hattie O'Donnell, who raised my brothers and me, and who would sooner burn the house down than allow anything improper. My brothers and I consider Miss Ashmore a lady of the highest character. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to all 3 of us." Ransom put his hand on Winifred's shoulder. The gesture was small, but in a room full of people watching, it said everything. Mrs. Patterson was not finished. 3 handsome men, 1 young lady. Which of the Whitaker brothers has won her heart, or is it a shared interest? The room went quiet. Winifred felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin and met Mrs. Patterson's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "At this moment, Mrs. Patterson, my heart belongs to no man, only to my own sense of honor and to God. The Whitaker brothers gave me work, respect, and shelter when I had nothing. Whatever gossip your mind invents says more about your imagination than my conduct. Good evening." She took Ezra's arm and walked to the dance floor. The room parted for them. Ezra led her into a waltz, and his hand was warm and steady on her back, and the music carried them in circles past the staring faces of half a county. "You are magnificent, Winifred," he whispered. "I am terrified," she whispered back. Same thing he said and smiled. But the real encounter that night was not with Mrs. Patterson. It was with Cornelius Dalton, who appeared at the edge of the dance floor in his New York suit, with a glass of punch and the look of a man who had come to survey his future territory. He introduced himself to Winifred with the easy charm of a predator, complimented her dress, offered her employment in St. Louis in a voice smooth enough to spread on toast. Silas materialized at her side like a shadow taking solid form and told Dalton that Miss Ashmore's dance card was full. Dalton smiled, tipped his hat, and left with a parting remark about hoping the ranch would survive the winter. It was a declaration of war dressed up as small talk, and every person in the room knew it. The plan came to Winifred on a night in early January when she was sitting at the ranch office desk studying the geological survey maps that Thaddeus Whitaker had collected decades ago. She found it on a map dated 1851. Widow's Creek had once run east of its current channel through softer ground of shale and sandstone before an earthquake in 53 had shifted the watercourse westward. The old channel was still visible on the survey, a ghost path carved into the land's memory. She brought it to the brothers. "We do not fight the dam," she said. "We make it irrelevant. If the old channel is reopened, the creek will follow it naturally. It will bypass Dalton's Dam entirely and rejoin the main waterway downstream on our land." Ransom, who had spent 6 months working in the Wyoming coal mines in 1871 and knew more about controlled explosions than any man in the valley, studied the map with growing intensity. "3 charges," he said slowly, "placed at the weak points in the ridge shelf above the old channel. Crack the stone, let the water find the path it used to take before the earthquake moved it. Nature does the rest. It has to be at night," Silas said. "New moon. And it has to be all 4 of us, because I need 1 person setting charges, 1 carrying supplies, 1 on lookout, and 1 coordinating." "That means you too, Winifred." She nodded. She had known it would. She had been practicing with the Winchester for weeks, and Ransom had said she had a hunter's eye. She was not going to let the men she loved ride into danger while she sat in a warm kitchen and wondered. They left on a Thursday night new moon, the darkness so complete that Winifred could not see her own hands on the reins. Ransom led on Ghost because the gray horse could navigate by instinct, and Ransom could read the terrain through the soles of his boots. Silas rode beside Winifred. Ezra brought the pack mule with the charges. The ride took 3 hours. They left the horses a mile from the dam site and went forward on foot, moving through scrub pine and frozen earth in silence. At the ridge above the old creek channel, Ransom went to work. He drilled into the shale with hand tools muffled in cloth, working with the focused precision of a man whose hands knew exactly what they were doing and whose life depended on them doing it right. Silas helped carry supplies. Ezra positioned himself on high ground where he could watch Dalton's guard fire burning at the base of the dam below. Winifred crouched behind a boulder at the closest point to the guards, her Winchester across her knees and her heart hammering so loud she was certain they could hear it across the valley. An hour passed, 90 minutes. Ransom was setting the final charge when Winifred heard hooves. 3 riders carrying lanterns moving along the ridge toward Ransom's position. She had 2 seconds to decide. She picked up a stone and hurled it into the brush 20 yards to her left. The crash drew the riders toward the decoy. Ransom heard the diversion, set the final charge, and scrambled back. But one rider turned back toward her. His lantern swung in an arc that would find her in 3 seconds. Winifred raised the Winchester and fired once over his head. The shot cracked the night open. The rider scattered. From below, voices erupted. "Run," Silas said from the darkness. "Now." They ran. Winifred had never run so fast or so blind. She followed the sound of Silas's boots crashing through brush, scrambling over rocks, her lungs burning. Behind them, the fuses burned. The first explosion split the darkness with a light like concentrated sunrise. The sound was enormous, a crack that echoed off every mountain in the valley. The ground shook, the second explosion, the third. And then the deep thundering sound of water finding a new path roaring through fractured stone with the force of something that had been waiting 23 years to go home. They reached the horses, they mounted, they rode hard through darkness. At dawn, they stood on the hill above Whitaker Ranch and watched the sun come up over a valley that had changed overnight. Widows Creek ran east now, exactly where the 1851 survey said it had run before the earthquake. Dalton's Dam stood empty and useless, a monument to money spent on the wrong side of nature. Ransom was grinning. Ezra was shaking his head in disbelief. Winifred's legs were trembling so badly she could barely stand. Silas caught her when she stumbled, and he held her for 3 seconds longer than steadying required. And in those 3 seconds, something fundamental shifted between them. "She is a Whitaker now," Silas Ransom said quietly. "Might as well face it." Dalton's retaliation came the next morning. He arrived with Sheriff Wyatt Morrison and 8 armed men demanding arrests, screaming about sabotage and destruction of property. Morrison, a weathered man of 58 who had kept the peace in Collier Creek since before the war, listened to Dalton's accusations with the patience of a man who had heard it all before and found most of it tiresome. "The explosions occurred on public territorial land, Mr. Dalton. The creek redirected through a natural channel that predates your ownership by decades. I have no evidence linking anyone to anything." But Dalton had come prepared with a weapon more devastating than any rifle. He pulled out a letter, notarized, from a Mrs. Harriet Prescott of Boston. The letter stated that Winifred Ashmore had been dismissed from her position as governess in the Prescott household in 1876 for, as the document carefully phrased it, improper conduct with the eldest son of the family. The truth was different. The truth was that Edgar Prescott, 19 years old and drunk on his father's brandy, had cornered Winifred in the parlor and attempted to force himself on her. She had fought him off. His mother had walked in and blamed Winifred. Because it is always easier to blame the hired girl than the heir. But the truth does not matter when the lie is on paper and signed by a woman of social standing. Dalton read the letter aloud in the yard in front of the sheriff and his men and anyone else within earshot, and then he looked at Silas with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had found the winning card. 3 days, he said. Send the girl away, and we can discuss the water rights like reasonable men. Keep her, and this letter goes to every newspaper between here and Philadelphia. He left. The yard emptied, and Winifred stood in the silence of the kitchen, knowing that everything she had built in the past 3 months was balanced on the edge of a knife. That night, she packed her bags. She wrote a letter to Silas and left it on the kitchen table with her mother's cameo brooch beside it. The letter thanked him for everything. It explained the truth about the Prescotts. It said she would not allow Dalton to use her as a weapon against the family that had given her the only real home she had ever known. She was heading for the door at 3 in the morning when Silas appeared in the hallway. He was wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers as though he had been awake and waiting. His eyes were red. "Where are you going?" he said. "You know where. Put the bags down, Winifred." "Silas?" She could not look at him. "If I stay, he will destroy you. If you leave, he already has." She turned. He was standing 3 feet away, and the look on his face was something she had never seen, not on him, not on anyone. It was the look of a man who had been breaking for 8 years and had finally found the thing that could either finish the duel or put him back together, and he was choosing. "I spent 8 hours in that barn tonight," he said, "thinking. And here's what I know." He stepped closer. "I know that Winifred Ashmore is the most honorable woman I have ever met. I know that a lying letter from a Boston socialite does not change who you are. I know that you rode into a blizzard for my brothers and set bones in a cabin with strips torn from your own clothes and organized 5 years of chaos into something that makes sense. I know that you stood in front of Mrs. Patterson and refused to be diminished. I know that you taught yourself to shoot and came with us up that mountain when any sane person would have stayed behind." His voice broke just slightly on the next words. "And I know that I have been in love with you since the night you told me that grief is not the same as fault and that some deaths do not belong to us. And I have been too afraid and too broken and too damn stubborn to say it out loud because the last woman I loved died in this house, and I could not survive that again. The silence was enormous. Then Winifred spoke, and her voice was steady even though her hands were shaking. Silas Whitaker, I have loved you since the second night when you trusted me with Margaret's name. I have loved you through every morning at the stove and every evening by the fire and every time you went back for a second piece of cornbread and thought no one noticed. I love you because you are real and flawed and trying, and that is more than most men ever manage. He reached for her. His hands, those enormous calloused hands that could split firewood all day without trembling, were shaking now. He cupped her face the way a man holds something precious that he has been afraid to touch. Stay, he said. I am staying, she said. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because everywhere else is nowhere without you. He kissed her, the first kiss of her life. It was gentle and brief and tasted of coffee and courage, and all the years they had both spent alone. When it ended, he pressed his forehead against hers and closed his eyes, and in the quiet of the old house built by his father's hands, two people who had been broken found each other and decided together that they were done being broken. The door closes softly here, and when morning came, everything had changed between them. The reckoning arrived with the sunrise. Dalton's carriage appeared at the ranch gate, but before it reached the yard, another rider came from the east, a man in a black duster and a silver badge flanked by 6 federal deputies on tall horses. Federal Marshal Beauregard Hawthorne dismounted with the unhurried authority of a man who had spent his career hunting people who believed they were above the law. Cornelius Dalton, he said, I have a federal warrant for your arrest. Securities fraud, investor fraud, and embezzlement in the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. The Eastern Railroad Investment Company you claim to represent does not exist and never has. You have been defrauding investors for 3 years. Dalton's face went the color of old paste. The marshal turned to Silas. I received a telegram 3 weeks ago containing financial evidence that broke this case open. Detailed records of forged documents and fraudulent transactions. Would you know who sent it? Silas looked at Winifred. Every eye in the yard followed. Winifred's chin came up. I wrote to my father's friend in Portsmouth, she said. Mr. Charles Sinclair of the First National Bank. He investigated Dalton's company through his banking connections and discovered the entire operation was a fraud. I forwarded the evidence to the Marshal Service. Ezra stared at her. When did you do this? The day after the Kovacs barn burned. She met his eyes without flinching. I was not going to let him hurt anyone else. Dalton lunged toward her. His composure shattered his face, contorted with rage. But Silas stepped between them, 6.5 feet of mountain granite, and looked at Dalton with eyes that promised violence if violence was invited. You speak to my woman like that again, Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. In federal warrant or no, you will not make it to trial. The yard went very quiet. Winifred looked at Silas. Your woman. Color rose in his weathered cheeks, the first blush she had ever seen from him. He started. Winifred Warhouse. About time, Brother Ransom said from somewhere behind them. About 8 years past time, Ezra added. Dalton was led away in handcuffs. Phineas Bradley was arrested the same afternoon at his empty ranch for conspiracy and fraud. When the last rider had disappeared down the road, Hattie emerged from the house with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that said she had been waiting for this exact moment since the night Winifred arrived 3 months ago. I am 64 years old, she announced. I do not have patience for drawn-out courtships. Boy, if you love this girl, you tell her properly. Girl, if you love this man, you say yes. The rest of us are exhausted from watching you two dance around each other like moths around a lantern. Ransom stepped forward and wrapped Winifred in a bear hug that lifted her clean off the ground. I love you like the sister I always wanted, he said. But you belong to Silas. I saw it the first day at that locked gate. So did Ezra. Ezra nodded. His eyes were bright, and he made no effort to hide it. He is right, Winifred. Go on and put us all out of our misery. That afternoon, Silas took Winifred's hand and led her down the hill behind the house to a place she had not seen before. An old apple tree, gnarled and bare, standing alone in the clearing, with a hand-carved wooden bench beneath it. "My father carved this bench in 1846, Silas said. "The year he married my mother. He proposed to her right here under this tree." He turned to face her, and in his amber eyes there was no granite left. Only firelight and hope and a vulnerability that would have broken her heart if it had not also been the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Winifred Claire Ashmore," he said, "I am 38 years old and I have been carrying grief like a stone in my chest for 8 years. You came into my life through a locked gate with $4 and a backbone made of iron, and you cracked that stone open and let the light in. I am not a man of pretty words. I am a man of work and weather and hands that know how to build things. But if you will have me, I will spend every day of my life building something worthy of you." He pulled a ring from his pocket, silver simple worn smooth by decades of wear. His mother Rebecca's wedding ring. "Will you marry me?" Winifred looked at the ring and at the bare apple tree and the bench his father had carved, and the mountains rising behind them like witnesses to a covenant that was older than language. "Yes," she said, "1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been waiting for her. He drew her close and kissed her beneath the apple tree where his father had kissed his mother 30 years before, and the late autumn sun poured over them like a benediction. The door closed softly on that day, and what lay beyond it belonged only to them. They married in May of 1877 under the apple tree with half the county in attendance and the Bitterroot Mountains standing as witnesses. Reverend Obadiah Thompson performed the ceremony. Hattie wept openly and denied it afterward. Ezra served as best man. Ransom walked Winifred down the path to the tree in place of the father she no longer had, and before he placed her hand in Silas's, he leaned down and whispered, "Welcome home, sister." Even Mrs. Patterson came sitting in the back row with pursed lips and a new hat, and the grudging acknowledgement that perhaps she had been wrong about one or two things. The seasons turned. Summer came with wildflowers that carpeted the valley in yellow and purple and white, and with them came the work of expansion that Winifred had been planning since the day she reorganized the ranch books. With Dalton gone and his assets frozen, the Bradley property went to auction. The Whitaker brothers, together with the Jacobsons and the Kovacs family, and 3 other small ranchers Winifred had organized into an informal cooperative, purchased the land and its water rights for a fraction of what Dalton had paid. They named the property Hope Ranch because Winifred said every place that offered people a second chance needed a name that reflected that. Hope Ranch became what Winifred had envisioned in the dark days of January when Dalton's shadow still lay across the valley. A refuge, a starting place, a farm where young women who had been stranded or abandoned or cheated by the promises of men could find shelter, honest work, and time to figure out who they wanted to become. The first arrival was a girl of 19 named Annabelle Lockwood from Philadelphia, who had been lured west by a fiancé who turned out to be married to someone else. Winifred met her at the gate of Hope Ranch, the gate that was never locked, and said the words she wished someone had said to her. "Welcome. You are safe now. The gate is open." In January of 1878, on a night when the snow fell so thick it seemed to erase the boundary between earth and sky, Winifred gave birth to her first child, a boy. They named him Thaddeus Silas Whitaker after his grandfather and his father, and when Silas held him for the first time, those enormous calloused hands trembled, as though they were holding the whole weight of the future. Hattie stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face and declared, at last, this house has a baby in it again." The years unfolded the way years do on the frontier, marked not by calendars, but by seasons, by births and deaths, in the slow accumulation of labor and love, and the particular kind of wisdom that comes from surviving things that should have destroyed you. In 1880, Ezra married Harriet Bellwether, the school teacher's daughter from Collier Creek, who shared his love of books and had the stubborn patience required to love a man whose war wounds were invisible but permanent. In 1881, Winifred bore a daughter, Rebecca Cordelia, named for Silas's mother, and Winifred's mother, 2 women who had never met, but whose legacies had made everything possible. In 1883, Ransom married Annabelle Lockwood, the first girl Hope Ranch had taken in, who had arrived frightened and furious and had grown into a woman as tough and practical as the mountains themselves. In 1884, a third child came, Charles Ambrose, named for the Portsmouth banker who had helped bring Dalton down, and for the minister father who had taught Winifred that duty and love were the same thing. In 1886, Hattie O'Donnell died in her sleep at the age of 74, with a rosary in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. They buried her beneath the apple tree next to the bench Thaddeus Whitaker had carved, and Silas stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and said, "She raised us. Without her, none of this exists. She was our mother in every way that mattered." In 1888, the youngest child arrived, a boy they named Ezra Ransom, for the two uncles who had stood by Winifred and Silas through blizzards and explosions and courtroom battles and the thousand small crises of building a life from nothing. Hope Ranch grew. By 1890, it had sheltered 23 women. 11 stayed in the valley and married. 7 returned east with new skills and new confidence. 5 became teachers or nurses in nearby towns. The cooperative that Winifred had organized held 18 ranches, met monthly in the Jacobson barn, and had become the economic backbone of the Bitterroot Valley. It was not perfect. Nothing built by human hands is perfect. There were fights, loud ones, about money and water rights and grazing schedules and the 100 points of friction that arise when stubborn people try to work together. But they work through them because that is what people do when they have decided that quitting is not an option. The years continued their patient work. Thaddeus Silas grew tall and quiet like his father and married Sarah Jacobson from the neighboring ranch. Rebecca Cordelia went east to study medicine and became one of the first women to graduate from the University of Michigan Medical School, returning to the valley with a doctor's bag and the same iron will that had carried her mother across a continent. Charles Ambrose studied law with his uncle Ezra's encouragement. Ezra Ransom, the youngest, loved horses like his uncle and namesake and never wanted to be anywhere but the ranch. In the fall of 1906, 30 years after a frightened young woman stood at a locked gate with $4 and no future, Winifred Whitaker sat on the porch of the house that Thaddeus Whitaker had built and that Silas had spent a lifetime improving, and she watched her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers. Silas sat beside her. He was 68 now. His hair had gone silver. His shoulders stooped slightly, but his hands were still strong, his eyes still amber, and his word was still iron. "Do you remember that gate?" he asked. "Every day," she said. "That girl," he said, "the one standing in the dust with $4. If someone had told her that one day she would be sitting here with a husband and 4 children and grandchildren, running through the yard, would she have believed it?" Winifred thought about it honestly, about Portsmouth and Philadelphia, and the locked gate and the 3 riders who had appeared against an orange sky like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. No, she said, she would not have believed it. She looked out at the valley. The Bitterroot Mountains were turning purple in the evening light, the same purple they had been the day she'd arrived. But everything else had changed. The land was not empty anymore. It was full of homes and families and a community that had grown from the stubborn refusal of a handful of people to let one greedy man destroy what they had built. But she knew something Winifred said. That girl at the gate. Deep down she knew. Knew what? That the locked gate was not the end of the road. It was just an old door closing, so that a new one, a better one, could open. Silas took her hand. His grip was still calloused and warm and solid, the hand that had pulled her up onto a horse 30 years ago and had never let her go. "You are home now, Winifred. Claire Whitaker," he said, "and this mountain chose you, just like it chose me, just like it will choose our children and their children for as long as the Bitterroot runs." She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the sun go down behind the mountains that had tried to kill her and had ended up giving her everything. "Winter always ends," she said softly. Silas kissed the top of her silver-streaked hair. "This one ended a long time ago," he said. And in the gathering dusk, with the sound of grandchildren laughing and the smell of Hattie's roses blooming along the path and the old apple tree standing patient and gnarled on the hill where 2 generations of Whitakers had pledged their hearts. Winifred closed her eyes and counted blessings the way her mother had taught her. 1 for the roof over her head, 2 for the man beside her, 3 for the children they had raised, 4 for the ranch that had given her purpose, 5 for the community that had given her belonging, 6 for the locked gate that had forced her to find a different way through. She lost count somewhere past 100, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The gate that was once locked was now forever open. The woman who was once left behind had become the one who built doors for others. And the story of Winifred Ashmore and Silas Whitaker and the mountains that tested them well. That story was still being told 30 years later by grandchildren who sat on the porch and listened to the wind come down off the Bitterroot and asked their grandmother to tell it one more time. And she always did. Because some stories deserve to be told until the mountains themselves forget how to stand. And if you have listened this far, friend, then thank you. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me tonight. This is your home too for as long as you want to stay. You are home now. Winter always ends, and the gate is always open.